Have you ever been made to feel invisible in a room full of people who are supposed to love you? Not just overlooked, but deliberately, painfully erased, your very presence treated as an inconvenience or, worse, a prop for someone else's story. Alara Beaumont knew this feeling intimately. She felt it in the marrow of her bones, a cold draft that no amount of lavish heating in her husband's ancestral home could ever warm. Tonight, the feeling was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders as she stood in the grand ballroom of the Beaumont estate. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and blooming peonies, felt suffocating. Crystal chandeliers, each one worth more than her childhood home, dripped light onto a sea of tailored suits and silk gowns. Laughter, light and brittle, tinkled through the room, but none of it reached her. She was an island, dressed in a stunning sapphire gown her husband, Julian, had picked out, a living mannequin meant to advertise his good taste and fortune. She held a champagne flute, the glass cool and rigid against her clammy palm, a perfect, fragile thing in a room full of perfect, fragile things. Julian was across the room, holding court. He was magnetic, his smile easy and his posture confident. He moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of a man who had never once doubted his place in the world. To everyone else, he was the charming, successful scion of the Beaumont Empire. To Alara, he was a beautifully crafted cage. When his eyes met hers from across the room, there was no warmth, no connection. It was a glance of assessment, checking to see if his investment was performing, if the dress was hanging correctly, if she was smiling her pretty, vacant smile. She offered a small one, a tremor at the corner of her lips, and he gave a curt nod before turning back to his laughing admirers. His father, Arthur Beaumont, a man whose face seemed permanently carved into a mask of smug disapproval, drifted past her without a word, his gaze sliding over her as if she were part of the furniture. He had never approved of the marriage, making it clear from the beginning that Alara, with her modest background and quiet nature, was a dilution of the Beaumont bloodline, a temporary amusement for his son. In these moments, Alara felt her own identity begin to fray at the edges. Who was she if not Mrs. Julian Beaumont? Before him, she had been Alara Harding, a woman with dreams of opening a small bakery, a woman who found joy in the simple alchemy of flour and sugar, a woman whose hands were skilled and whose heart was open. But Julian had found those dreams quaint, provincial. He had loved the idea of her, a beautiful, unspoiled girl he could mold and polish, but he had no interest in the person attached to that idea. He had systematically dismantled her ambitions, not with overt cruelty, but with the soft, dismissive condescension that was his signature weapon. Her business plan was adorable. Her desire to work with her hands was unbecoming slowly. She had let those parts of herself go dormant, convincing herself that this opulent, hollow life was what she should want, that this was security, that this was love. But tonight, the illusion was wearing thin. The reflection she saw in the polished marble floors was of a stranger, a beautiful ghost haunting a life that was not her own. She took a slow breath, the borrowed corset of her gown digging into her ribs, and she felt a desperate, rising need to simply be seen, to be acknowledged as more than just a beautiful object in Julian Beaumont's collection. The moment of absolute, soul-crushing humiliation arrived, as it often did, disguised as a celebration. Julian, flushed with champagne and adoration, stepped onto the small, elevated stage at the front of the ballroom. A microphone was handed to him, and a hush fell over the crowd. He was about to give the annual toast at the Beaumont Foundation's charity gala, the pinnacle of the family's public-facing benevolence. Alara's stomach tightened. She knew his rhythms, the cadence of his public performances. He would be charming, witty, and just self-deprecating enough to appear humble. But tonight, there was a different glint in his eye, a cruel spark of inspiration. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice smooth and resonant. "Tonight, we celebrate success. We celebrate ambition. But it's also important," he paused, letting the silence hang, "to remember where we come from. To remember the importance of sacrifice." He scanned the crowd, his gaze landing on Alara. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. In fact, my own beautiful wife, Alara, is a perfect example of this. A few people turned to look at her, their expressions curious. Alara felt a prickle of dread. This was not part of the script. She came from such simple beginnings, he continued, the word simple laced with a delicate, dismissive poison. And she had her own little dreams. In fact, just the other day, she showed me a business plan she had written. Didn't you, darling? He beckoned her to the stage. Come on, don't be shy, the invitation was a command. Her feet felt like lead, but to refuse would be to cause a scene, an even greater sin in this world of flawless surfaces. She walked toward him, the sea of faces a blur of polite smiles and curious eyes. She felt like a lamb being led to slaughter. When she reached his side, he didn't take her hand. He put an arm around her shoulder, a gesture that looked supportive but felt like a restraint. She wanted to open a bakery, Julian announced to the crowd, his tone that of a parent revealing a child's endearing but foolish fantasy. A little shop that would sell, what was it, darling? Cupcakes and artisan bread. He laughed, a short, sharp bark. Can you imagine? My wife, covered in flour, getting up at 4 in the morning to knead dough. He squeezed her shoulder tightly. But she sacrificed that little dream for a much bigger one. For this. For the Beaumont family. For me, he looked at her, his eyes cold and commanding, daring her to contradict him, to show any hint of the fury and shame that was flooding her veins. He was not honoring her. He was neutering her past, reducing her ambition to a childish whim that she had wisely abandoned for the grand prize of being his wife. It just goes to show, he concluded, turning back to the audience, that we all have to give things up to get ahead. Some of us give up a little, and some of us, he patted her shoulder again, a final, dismissive gesture, give up everything. He then leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And, honestly, given her family's cooking, her giving up on a bakery was probably a sacrifice for the public good, too. A beat of silence followed Julian's final, cruel punchline. It was a silence filled with 100 unspoken questions as the guests processed the casual brutality of the joke. Was he serious? Was this their strange, upper-class banter? Then, from the front row, a single sound broke the tension. It was Arthur Beaumont, Julian's father. He threw his head back and let out a loud, booming laugh. It was not a sound of genuine amusement, it was a sound of endorsement, a seal of approval on his son's public execution of his wife's spirit. The laugh was a permission slip. Instantly, it was followed by others, Julian's sycophantic friends, board members eager to stay in the Beaumonts' good graces, people for whom cruelty was a spectator sport as long as they weren't the target. The laughter swelled, filling the grand ballroom, echoing off the high, frescoed ceilings. It was a sharp, ugly, shattering sound. For Alara, standing on that stage next to her smiling husband, the world narrowed to that noise. It was a physical assault, each wave of laughter a blow against her soul. The heat rushed to her face, a painful, prickling blush that she was sure everyone could see. Her vision blurred, the faces in the crowd melting into a monstrous, jeering mess. She could feel Julian's hand on her back, patting her condescendingly as if she were a dog who had just performed a trick. "Good sport, isn't she?" he said to the crowd, his voice filled with false warmth. He leaned in close to her ear, his breath hot and smelling of whiskey. "Smile, Alara. They're laughing with us, but they weren't laughing with her. They were laughing at her. At her small dreams, at her humble past, at her utter powerlessness in this moment. It was the most profound and public stripping of her dignity she had ever endured. Her mind went blank with shock and pain. The woman who had once dreamed of creating things, of building a small corner of the world that was her own, was now just an object of ridicule, a footnote in her husband's triumphant speech. He had taken the last, private piece of her that she had cherished, her quiet ambition, and had broken it in front of the world for a cheap laugh. He gave her one last pat and then, with a flick of his hand, dismissed her. "You can go back to your seat now, darling," she turned, her movements stiff and robotic. Every eye in the room was on her as she descended the small steps from the stage. She didn't look at anyone. She couldn't. She fixed her gaze on the intricate pattern of the Persian rug, focusing on the swirling blues and golds as she walked the longest 10 yards of her life back to her empty chair at the head table. She sat down, her hands folded in her lap, her posture a perfect, rigid imitation of composure. But inside, she was disintegrating. The laughter had stopped, replaced by the low hum of conversation, but she could still hear it ringing in her ears, a phantom echo of her own annihilation. Ilara sat through the rest of the applause for Julian, her face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. But the moment the attention shifted, the moment the waiters began to move and the music swelled to fill the space left by her humiliation, she pushed her chair back and stood. She moved with a quiet, desperate urgency, slipping through a side door and into the blessed anonymity of a long, cold corridor. The sudden silence was a relief, but it did nothing to quiet the storm inside her. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. She leaned against the cool marble wall, pressing her forehead against the stone, willing it to leach the burning shame from her skin. Tears, hot and furious, finally broke free, tracing silent paths down her cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness, but of rage. Rage at Julian, at his father, at the roomful of people who had watched her be dismantled and had done nothing. But most of all, rage at herself for letting it happen, for becoming so small and quiet that someone thought they could treat her this way without consequence. She pulled her phone from her small, beaded clutch, her fingers fumbling with the smooth, cold device. Her hand trembled so violently she could barely unlock it. She needed to hear a friendly voice, someone who saw her as Ilara, not as a Beaumont accessory. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering over the name of her best friend, then stopping. What would she even say? How could she articulate the depth of this betrayal without sounding pathetic, like a victim? It felt like a failure too profound to share. Her thumb continued to scroll, almost of its own accord, until it stopped on a name she rarely called for help. Mom. A fresh wave of hesitation washed over her. Her mother was General Catherine Harding, a woman who had commanded battalions, who had advised presidents, a woman whose entire life was a testament to strength, discipline, and unwavering integrity. Ilara had always felt a need to prove herself worthy of such a legacy, to handle her own battles, to never appear weak or fragile in the eyes of the strongest person she knew. Calling her mother felt like an admission of defeat. But this wasn't a battle she could fight alone. This wasn't about a scraped knee or a failed exam. This was a violation of the core principles her mother had instilled in her: honor, self-respect, and the refusal to be broken. Her fingers moved over the keyboard, tapping out a short, coded message they had established years ago, a relic from her more rebellious teenage years. It was their emergency signal, reserved for situations that were beyond her control. Red flag on the field. It was an admission that the defenses were down, that the situation was critical, that she needed her commander. She stared at the words for a long moment, her heart pounding. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she pressed send. There was no immediate reply, and she didn't expect one. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that the message had been received. A tiny seed of hope, fragile but defiant, began to sprout in the barren wasteland of her despair. Help was coming. Back in the ballroom, Julian was riding the crest of his social triumph. He accepted congratulations from his peers, his laughter now genuine, fueled by a potent cocktail of power and arrogance. He had successfully reminded everyone of his dominance, not just in business, but in his own home. He had put his simple wife in her place, and the world had applauded him for it. His father, Arthur, stood beside him, a proud smile on his face. "Sharp wit, my boy," Arthur said, clapping him firmly on the shoulder. "It's important to maintain perspective. Remind people who is in charge." Julian nodded, draining his glass. "She needed to be reminded," he said, his voice low. She was getting ideas. Their shared glance was one of complete, entitled understanding. They were the architects of their world, and everyone else, Ilara included, was merely a resident, subject to their rules. It was at that precise moment of supreme self-satisfaction that the grand, oak doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. They didn't creak or drift open. They were pushed with a silent, deliberate force that commanded immediate attention. The low hum of conversation faltered and then died completely as every head in the room turned toward the entrance. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Standing framed in the doorway was a figure of such commanding presence that she seemed to suck all the air out of the room. It was a woman, tall and severe, her silver-streaked hair cut in a sharp, no-nonsense style. She was not in military uniform, but the impeccably tailored black pantsuit she wore might as well have been. Her posture was ramrod straight, her chin high, her gaze sweeping across the opulent room with an unnerving, analytical calm. It was General Catherine Harding. Flanking her, standing just a step behind, were two other women. They were younger, dressed in similar dark, functional attire. Their faces were impassive, their eyes constantly moving, scanning the crowd, the exits, the layout of the room with a quiet, professional alertness that was more intimidating than any overt threat. They were not guests. They were not staff. They were a statement. A hush fell over the gala, the kind of absolute, weighted silence that follows a sudden, shocking event. The music had sputtered to a stop. Waiters froze mid-step, trays held aloft. The Beaumont's guests, paragons of industry and society, were rendered utterly still, their polite smiles frozen on their faces. Julian and Arthur turned, their expressions shifting from smug satisfaction to utter confusion. Julian's smile faltered. "What in God's name?" Arthur muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing at the unexpected and clearly unwelcome intrusion. General Harding's eyes, sharp and piercing as a hawk's, found Alara, who was just now stepping back into the ballroom from the corridor, drawn by the sudden silence. For a fraction of a second, the general's steely expression softened with a flicker of maternal concern, a silent question passing between them. Then, the steel returned, harder than before. Her purpose crystallized. She took a step forward, and the room held its breath. General Harding began to walk. Her steps were measured, silent on the thick Persian rugs, yet each footfall seemed to reverberate through the cavernous ballroom. She moved not with the tentative grace of a guest, but with the unstoppable momentum of a force of nature. The crowd, a collection of the city's most powerful and influential people, instinctively parted for her. They created a wide, clear path, their collective deference a testament to the raw authority she projected. Her two companions followed in perfect, synchronized formation, their presence creating a perimeter of quiet, unassailable power around her. They were her honor guard, her sergeants at arms, their purpose clear without a single word being spoken. Julian watched her approach, his initial confusion curdling into a mixture of annoyance and anxiety. He was the king in this castle, and this woman was marching through his court as if she owned it. He smoothed his tie, attempting to regain his composure and the upper hand. Arthur Beaumont stood rigid, his face darkening with indignation. This was a flagrant breach of protocol, an insult to his family and his guests. The general did not stop at a table. She did not pause to acknowledge anyone. Her trajectory was direct, unerring. She was heading straight for the stage, where Julian and his father stood like startled monarchs whose reign was about to be unexpectedly challenged. The silence in the room was now so profound that the clinking of ice in a forgotten glass sounded like a gunshot. Everyone watched, mesmerized by the unfolding drama. This was something new, something real and raw that had pierced the carefully curated facade of their evening. Alara, standing near the doorway, felt a surge of adrenaline. The shame and fear that had paralyzed her just moments before were being replaced by something else, something she hadn't felt in a very long time, a sense of righteous power. Her mother had answered the call. She was no longer alone on the battlefield. She squared her shoulders, mirroring the posture she had seen her mother adopt 1,000 times, and watched. General Harding reached the foot of the low stage and stopped. She tilted her head back slightly, her gaze locking onto the two men who stood a few feet above her. She did not need to raise her voice. Her tone was conversational, yet it carried the chilling weight of a formal inquiry. "Julian," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the silence. She then shifted her gaze to the older man. Arthur, the use of their first names was not an act of familiarity, it was an act of leveling, stripping them of their titles and their perceived superiority. She held their stunned gazes for a long moment before she spoke again, her words precise and laden with meaning. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Julian blinked, momentarily thrown by the strange, possessive statement. He forced a laugh, a hollow, nervous sound that echoed unnaturally in the silent room. "General Harding. Catherine." "What a surprise," he stammered, trying to fall back on his well-practiced charm. "I don't know what you mean. If you're talking about a wedding gift we forgot to send, I'm sure we can." He was cut off by the general's unwavering stare. "I am not speaking of property, Julian," she said, her voice dropping a register, becoming colder, harder. "We both know you have plenty of that." Her eyes flickered around the opulent ballroom, a silent indictment of the shallow values it represented, before locking back onto him with piercing intensity. "I am speaking of dignity. I am speaking of honor. I am speaking of respect." Each word was a carefully aimed shot. "You took my daughter's dignity tonight, in this room, in front of all these people. You held it up for entertainment. And you laughed as you did it." Her words were not an accusation, they were a statement of fact, delivered with the indisputable certainty of a field report. There was no room for debate. The truth of it hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Julian's charming facade began to crack. A flush crept up his neck. "Now, wait just a minute," he blustered. It was a joke. A little light-hearted teasing between a husband and wife. "Alara understands my sense of humor." He shot a desperate look towards Alara, silently pleading with her to play along, to rescue him from this bizarre and humiliating confrontation. But Alara did not move. She stood near the back, her spine straight as a ramrod, her expression clear and resolute. She was no longer his prop, she was a silent witness for the prosecution. She met his gaze across the room, and for the first time, he saw not a timid, accommodating wife, but a reflection of the formidable woman standing before him. The family resemblance had never been in their features, but in their spirit, and he had just awakened it. General Harding continued, her voice a low, controlled force. "A man of honor does not use his wife's dreams as a punchline. A man of character does not build himself up by tearing down the person he vowed to protect. What you call a joke, Julian, I call a profound failure of character. It is a weakness I find contemptible." She spoke with the direct, thematic clarity of a leader addressing her troops, her words resonating with a moral authority that dwarfed the financial power of the Beaumont name. "You seem to believe that strength is about mockery and public dominance," she said, her gaze unflinching. "Let me be very clear. True strength is found in lifting others up, especially those you claim to love. It is a lesson you have evidently never learned." Julian's face, once a mask of confident charm, was now a canvas of exposed fury and embarrassment. He opened his mouth to retort, to defend his bruised ego, but it was Arthur Beaumont who stepped forward, his expression thunderous. The patriarch was reclaiming control. "Now you see here," Arthur began, his voice a low growl of pure arrogance. "I have had quite enough of this melodrama. This is a private party, a philanthropic event. I don't know what you think you're doing, barging in here with your staff," he finished, waving a dismissive hand toward the two women flanking the general. It was a calculated insult, designed to diminish their presence, to categorize them as mere servants. In response, one of the women, the one standing to the general's right, did not flinch. She simply, almost casually, adjusted the front of her black jacket. The movement was slight, economical, but it was enough. For a brief second, the dark, checkered grip of a holstered firearm was visible against the stark white of her shirt. It wasn't a threat, not in the aggressive, cinematic sense. It was a quiet, unassailable fact. It was a symbol of the world Catherine Harding came from, a world of serious consequences, of real power, not the flimsy, performative power on display in this ballroom. The subtle reveal sent a fresh wave of shock through the onlookers. This was no longer just a family squabble, the stakes had been visibly, terrifyingly raised. Arthur Beaumont froze, his words catching in his throat. He understood threats, but they were usually financial, social. This was something entirely different, something he had no defense against. The general's gaze, cold as a winter sea, shifted to him. "A private party," she repeated, her voice dangerously soft. "A private party where you publicly condone the dishonoring of a member of my family. A private party where you laughed the loudest," her eyes narrowed. "That makes it my business, Arthur. The moment your son chose to make my daughter a spectacle for his own amusement, he forfeited any right to privacy. And you, by endorsing it, forfeited your right to my respect." She took a single step closer to the stage, a small movement that felt like a tectonic shift in the room's power dynamic. "You're the head of this family. You set the tone. You taught your son that wealth and status grant him a license for cruelty. You taught him that power means you can mock and diminish the very people you should cherish and protect. That is not just poor judgment, Arthur. That is a catastrophic failure of leadership." The final words landed with devastating precision, dismantling not just Arthur's authority in the moment, but the very foundation of his patriarchal pride. He was no longer the powerful host. He was a failed leader, being dressed down in front of his entire court. General Harding allowed her judgment to hang in the suffocating silence of the room for a long, heavy moment. She had systematically deconstructed their power, exposed their moral bankruptcy, and now it was time to deliver the final verdict. Her voice, when she spoke again, was devoid of anger. It was the calm, resolute voice of command, of decisions already made and consequences set in motion. "Ilara will be leaving with me tonight," she stated, not as a request, but as an unchangeable reality. "Her personal effects, everything she brought into this marriage, will be collected by my people tomorrow morning. You will ensure your staff provides them with unobstructed access." Julian's face went white. "You can't do that," he sputtered, a desperate, childish protest. "She's my wife." The general's gaze settled on him, and it was filled with something akin to pity. "She is my daughter," she countered softly, "and a person's worth is not defined by a marriage certificate, especially one that has been so thoroughly dishonored. You had your chance to be her partner, her protector. You chose to be her humiliator. Your tenure is over." She then turned her attention back to the stunned and impotent Arthur Beaumont. "You are a man who values assets, Arthur. Your life is a ledger of profits and losses. So let me speak to you in terms you will fully comprehend." She paused, letting the weight of her words gather. "You pride yourselves on your portfolio, on your acquisitions. But a family's greatest asset isn't its stock profile or its real estate holdings. Its greatest asset is its integrity, its honor. Tonight, for the price of a cheap laugh, you liquidated it." The business metaphor was a masterful, final twist of the knife, striking at the very core of the Beaumont identity. She had judged them by their own metrics and found them bankrupt. With the finality of a judge banging a gavel, she turned away from the two men on the stage, dismissing them completely. Her gaze found Ilara, who was now walking toward the front of the room, her head held high, tears of vindication shining in her eyes. The general's entire demeanor softened. The warrior vanished, and only the mother remained. She held out a strong, steady hand. Her voice was warm, filled with a love that was as fierce as her anger had been. "It's time to go home, soldier." Ilara took her mother's hand, her fingers gripping it tightly. The connection was an anchor, a promise of safety and unconditional love. Together, they turned their backs on the wreckage of the Beaumont Gala and walked toward the open doors, a queen and her reclaimed princess, leaving a trail of shattered arrogance and stunned silence in their wake. As they walked, the crowd watched them, not with pity or morbid curiosity, but with a kind of silent, breathless awe. They had just witnessed the complete and irrevocable demolition of a power structure they had all thought was immutable. As the grand doors swung shut behind Ilara, her mother, and their silent protectors, a new kind of silence fell upon the ballroom. It was the silence of reflection, of a profound and uncomfortable truth settling upon the guests. The story of that night was not just about a family dispute, it was a powerful lesson written in the language of human dignity. True strength, the kind that endures, is not forged in boardrooms or measured by stock portfolios. It is not found in the echo of condescending laughter or the exercise of petty power over another. Real strength, the kind that commands genuine respect, is built on a foundation of integrity. It is the courage to protect, the honor to uplift, and the character to celebrate the people in your life, not diminish them for sport. Ilara had allowed the glitter of a gilded world to obscure her own value. She had mistaken a cage for a castle and silence for peace. But deep within her, the lessons her mother had taught her lay dormant, waiting for a spark. Her husband's cruelty was that spark, and her mother's arrival was the fire that burned away the facade, revealing the unshakable truth of her own worth. She was not an accessory. She was not a sacrifice. She was a soldier's daughter, and within her flowed the same river of resilience and honor. Her journey from that ballroom was more than just a departure. It was a reclamation. She was reclaiming her name, her dreams, and her right to be treated with the fundamental respect every human being deserves. The Beaumonts, in their opulent hall, were left with nothing but their wealth, which now seemed a poor and hollow substitute for the integrity they had so carelessly thrown away. They had learned a hard lesson that you can own everything in the world, but if you do not have honor, you are truly bankrupt. Never let anyone, no matter how powerful or persuasive, convince you that you are small. Never allow someone else's laughter to silence the music of your own soul. Your worth is not negotiable. Your dignity is not a commodity to be traded. Remember the strength that lies within you, the legacy of those who loved you into being. Remind someone in your life who may be feeling invisible that they are seen, that they are valued, and that they are never, ever alone in their fight. Share this story if you believe that respect is the ultimate currency and that the greatest power in the world is the courage to stand up for it.